welcome to another episode of The Scope here on British Muslim TV with me, your host, Waqar Rizvi. We're here with another jam-packed episode with wonderful esteemed panelists. Just to let you know, as we always do, at the bottom of your screen, you can see those numbers, which you can use to send comments and or questions even throughout the show. And if any of them are pertinent, we will put them to our esteemed panelists as well. We are, of course, being broadcast live wherever BMTV is available on satellite, as well as throughout BMTV's various social media channels as well. Well, today we're discussing how a year ago, the US and NATO withdrew from Afghanistan, leaving that country in the hands of the Taliban, whom they had overthrown before getting involved in Afghanistan in 2001. Now, while the Taliban reflect on this year since their takeover as somewhat of a joyous occasion, and their ministries have applauded their supposed advances, others would take a much more critical view. Certainly, there is much to be said about the NATO/US legacy in Afghanistan and whether the economy, for example, was ever designed to survive on its own without US or NATO backing. And even on issues of governance, corruption was rampant in the 2 decades of the US presence. Now, considering the world has still not accepted the Taliban government, though, it is hard to see how the country will pull itself out of this stalemate. Do the Taliban have the answers for how to run their country independently and to do right by their people? I'm going to put that question and others to our esteemed panelists who are joining us today. We're joined by Dr. Melissa Chiovenda, who is an anthropologist. She's also an assistant professor at the College of Humanities and Social Sciences at Zayed University. And we're also joined by Dr. Arif Sahar, who is a researcher with the Center of Excellence in Terrorism, Resilience, Intelligence, and Organized Crime Research Institute at Sheffield Hallam University. Arif and Melissa, thank you both for taking your time out to join us today here in The Scope on BMTV. Melissa, I'd like to start with you, if I may, and I just want to ask you to reflect, if I may, for how we've gotten to this point and how it was that just a year ago we were talking about a U.S. withdrawal, those harrowing images, for example, we saw from Kabul airport. How do you reflect on all of that?
Well, I mean, looking back, it's still quite shocking. I remember the events of last summer, and at one point, it seemed that I wouldn't say that things were stable, but there still hadn't been the fall of a district center, and then all of a sudden, one started falling after the other, and yet, when Kabul actually did fall, it was quite surreal. And waking up the morning of August 15th, and for me, because I actually did research in Bamiyan, so seeing Bamiyan fall was kind of even more shocking. I didn't expect that. So there was this feeling of just, this is something surreal. This is something I can't believe is happening. But on the other hand, after years of studying Afghanistan, there were so many missteps, and I think we can probably all agree on that on the part of the United States and NATO. And again and again, wrong decisions were made. And so the flip side of it was, I think many of us who study Afghanistan also didn't expect a good outcome, and thought that, if we didn't expect maybe the Taliban to come completely back under control, but that there would certainly be some sort of different government or power sharing or something, because what was in place was just absolutely not sustainable.
Arif, I wonder, do you think all of us miscalculated a bit about how strong the Taliban really were when we started seeing the cities falling and the regions falling one by one to the Taliban control?
I think there have been many missteps and pitfalls that unfolded so quickly and rapidly that caught everybody by surprise. Nobody would expect the Taliban to be in full control of the country just within months. Given the fact that there were many processes and activities such as peacemaking and also the negotiation between the central government and the Taliban that was going on in Doha. So what we would expect would have been something quite different. But however, the events unfolded quite the other way around, the other way that the people had not even imagined. So that's why everybody, including the politicians and also the leadership, the political leadership at the top, found themselves in a desperate situation. However, I think the international community and also the Afghan government, they didn't understand each other. They did not work very hard to reconcile their differences and also their priorities. But in effect, with every single one of those international partners, including the Afghanistan politicians, they started pursuing their own priorities. And then it left a massive vacuum for the Taliban to exploit, and the Taliban did a kind of draw on the support they had within the social communities and also within the southern and the eastern regions where they originally come from. So drawing on all those missteps and pitfalls, so the Taliban, they kind of grabbed the opportunity and then they started occupying the central provinces. And apart from that, I think the Afghanistan government, particularly the head of the state, President Ghani at the time, he kind of entered a secret deal with the Taliban. And then he effectively handed the entire country to the Taliban. Otherwise, the Taliban, with the number of people they have got, with the amount of resources they had at their disposal, wouldn't be able to defeat such a strong army of 3,005, I think more than 350,000 personnel with a large amount of arsenal at their disposals. So basically, there were too many things to digest, but we have not been able to digest all these things effectively so far. It's just a matter of time and space to understand things fully.
You know, Melissa, as Arif there alluded to and spoke about, one of the big things that is shocking is that after 2 decades of NATO/US involvement and those Afghan governments that were in place throughout those 2 decades, for them to have been as weak as they were without the US support, what does that say to you? I mean, was this system, in a sense, and I don't want to go into conspiracy theory, but would you think the system was designed almost to just be dependent always on US NATO support, in a sense?
In some ways, I think I would say absolutely. I think the entire design of the government on one level was made with the interests of US, NATO goals, and in the beginning military operations, and then later on maybe other goals in mind, right? I mean, I am of course somebody who focuses on minority groups in Afghanistan. So something that was always very concerning to me was the highly centralized nature of the Republican government. And, when you have such a highly centralized government that's not really seen to be representative to a lot of people, of course, in comparison to the Taliban, it was more so, but still all the same, really being propped up by the outside, I think that's just a recipe for disaster, because when things started to go wrong, I think, there was some degree of national feeling and a real feeling that some people had to defend the Afghan state, but for others, it just wasn't worth it. It just wasn't worth more fighting and more bloodshed for a government that was brought in from the outside, and in addition to that, not representative of the people. Very centralized, just kind of pushing decrees out from the center, and that that caused a lot of resentment and anger and unhappiness, and surely weakened the whole structure.
Arif, do you agree with that? I mean, do you think that it was the centralized nature of these governments that was problematic? Because I mean, there certainly was a feeling, wasn't there, that and it sounds weird to even say this, but the Taliban were more in tune with the people than even the Kabul government?
I think for a nation state take hold, we would require 2 different pillars under all circumstances. The first one would be the hardware one, and then the second one would be the software one. In terms of the hardware one, we would require an economy, an inclusive structure, and also a functioning government that would be able to answer the demands of all the citizens, regardless of their backgrounds and perspectives. But however, the main problem lies within that software domain. The narrative upon which the nation state that we have got in Afghanistan is built is less inclusive. It is more exclusive. It is intolerant, and it is not a kind of corresponding, and it's not responding to the needs and demands of the people in terms of participation, in terms of inclusion, in terms of fair and equitable distribution of power resources. So that kind of puts ethnicity and ethnic politics at the center of everything that happens within the country or within that political unit. And then when the ethnic politics takes hold, then it makes it really, really difficult for different ethnic groups to come and communicate and engage with each other in a peaceful manner. So that's how the politics are kind of unfolded in post-war era in Afghanistan. So different narratives started coming up, and then they sought to carve and for their own ground. So effectively, the state that was built in post-war context, that kind of lacked a social legitimacy, and then it fell to gain the monopoly of power.
Arif, Melissa, following up with us, of course, after that break. So viewers, we've been discussing the situation in Afghanistan leading up to, of course, the Taliban takeover. And after this break, we will be discussing the Taliban themselves. And certainly, there were a lot of discussions, and some of these points will come up now after the break as well. But Taliban 2.0 is what many people were saying the Taliban now had become. Has that been proven? Have the Taliban lived up to their promises, as I mentioned in my introduction and an earlier question as well, in the Doha deal? Have they ensured security for their people? There are estimates and studies out there that are showing violence has in fact fallen in the country. Nevertheless, there has been significant enough violence by other parties and other groups towards minorities in the country as well, just of recently, especially in these first days of Muharram, especially towards the Hazara community. Also, then there's other issues certainly about the economy. That's vitally important as well, because for this country to be able to pick itself up, it needs to be able to survive somehow economically also. And then there is a huge issue, which we also know about, and that is, of course, of the girls' education. We'll be back after this break for more on that. Welcome back, everyone, to The Scope here on BMTV. We're continuing our discussion about the Taliban takeover a year ago with Melissa Chiovenda as well as Arif Sahar. And now, Melissa, before going to the break, we were discussing there, of course, about how we got to this point, or how we got to pretty much the point we were at, in fact, a year ago. But now I want to talk about the Taliban themselves and how they have fared. So going into this, when the Taliban were taking over and right in the early days after their takeover, there was a lot of talk in media about Taliban 2.0, how this was a different Taliban, that this was not the old Taliban before 2001. What are your thoughts on that?
My thoughts are that absolutely this is not a different Taliban. Very much of what they are doing seems to be very much in line with what they did their first go round. And there are so many points we can make about that. Women's place in society, the restrictions that are being placed on women, women's movement, education, and the exclusion of girls from education being one. I think the treatment of minorities is another huge one, where there's first off, there's now absolutely no representation of really any group other than a very specific Sunni Pashtun Taliban group ruling the country, and nobody else is included in that. You have some very disturbing reports of what I would call even ethnic cleansing of Hazaras being removed from land in villages and now also in West Kabul. So this doesn't really seem to be any different at all from what was going on in the past. Although, one thing, it seems like the way they're operated is they always want to kind of leave this sort of I don't know, question to say, well, maybe we're going to get better. Well, maybe we're not really like that. So like, for example, girls' schools haven't opened, except some of them are open in the north. So probably we're going to get to that. And yet I don't think any of us really believe that if we take the whole picture of women's situation in Afghanistan together, or if we look at minority situation in Afghanistan, there's like been a few, individuals or figures that are kind of placed in a position of semi-authority, and yet compared to all of the rest that has been happening, it pales in comparison, and it can't be held up. Yeah. So from my point of view, absolutely, there is no Taliban 2.0. This is really the same, and sometimes the exact same people, right, that we were dealing with 20 years ago.
Indeed. Arif, what are your thoughts on that? Because again, a year ago it looked different, right? In the sense that we and the Taliban had convinced us too, and in the media that they were going to be different, that they were going to abide by the international norms and the deal that they signed in Doha, and that they were going to let women be educated and girls be educated, et cetera, et cetera. That's just one aspect. But what are your thoughts on that?
I think the Taliban have slightly changed. So in terms of the agenda and also policies, they have not changed in any manner whatsoever. But in terms of how they would make their policies and agendas a brand in order to sell it to the international community, I think they have changed on that front, because they have become more complex now. They understand diplomacy now, and also they've got better access to technology. And then they have been better able to communicate with the world, and also with a large chunk of the population as well, where they kind of have been running this psychological warfare, which has been a major part of their effort over the last 20 years or so. But in terms of the actual agenda and also practice, they have not changed a lot. In terms of economy, in terms of security, and also treatment towards minorities, religious minorities, social groups, and also girls' education, there has not been any change. But what I would say is that the Taliban have changed, but they have changed for the worse, not for the better. And then they have been behaving really, really in complicated and complex ways. So it makes it really, really difficult for the world, for the international community, and also for the Afghans themselves to understand in what direction they would really, really want to take the country to. But however, what is quite clear from the fact is that the Taliban, they have not been working on building their capacities, on building or working on to build a functioning government, on working to provide public services to the public, and also in terms of the provision of security. So they have failed on all those accounts. In addition to these failures, so I think the Taliban have been providing a safe haven to a large number of international terrorist groups as well, which is making Afghanistan, I think, a major threat, not just for the regional context, but not just for the regional security pact, but also for the international security as well. So it is just a matter of time and space. So the more the Taliban remain in power, the more dangerous they will become, the more dangerous Afghanistan will become for the security and also for a smooth functioning of the political order around the country and the region.
Melissa, on the issue of women's rights / girls' education, the economy plays a huge part in this, right? Because there are so many harrowing stories right out there of Afghan families or Afghan parents having to make, I'm sure it is even for them, very tough decisions, certainly, as it would be for any parent to, give away their daughters, essentially, right? And those are, I'm sure that these are not decisions taken lightly for any parent, but nevertheless, that all comes down to the economy too. And in many ways, the world has to answer for that. I mean, I don't want to sound too cliche, but in the sense the world has walked away and is not supporting these people economically. And then they're also turning around and judging the country for the situation. It's sort of a paradox, isn't it, Melissa?
Yes, I agree with you completely. And, I'll maybe say something that might not be popular with a lot of people, but, there's a lot of question about the funds that have been frozen, and what should be done with that, and whether they should be, how to deal with this, because it shouldn't go into Taliban hands. And then a lot of the question about these sorts of funds and also other aid to be given, it seems to revolve around the question of, well, until they give women the rights they deserve, we're not going to disperse these funds. But I've gone back and forth on this, to be honest. But after a lot of thinking, I really, really believe, and I think this goes along with what you say, when we're looking at a complete economic collapse and we're looking at a humanitarian crisis of the proportions that are happening in Afghanistan, with 90% of the population food insecure, and leading to as you were mentioning, problems for the entire population, including women, leading into things like horrible situations with children, daughters being sold. Is this really helping things? And is this really going to, in the long run, lead to more rights for women? And to even take that a step further, I don't think it's going to work. I don't think that withholding these funds is going to push them in that direction, because their base, those who have always been behind them, I think are not going to support such policies anyways, so they wouldn't want to risk it. So at the end of the day, I think the international community and the United States, maybe more specifically, is faced with, do we save lives, or do we kind of punish the population because we don't want this money to get into the hands of the Taliban? But they're probably going to be okay anyways, and skimming off enough money from whatever there is anyways. So I don't really see that it's that much of a punishment to them, if that makes sense. So that's where I stand on that question right now. I know that was kind of a bit of a long answer, but I think
totally understand
the international
your
community is letting us down.
Yeah. Arif, I wanted to give you the final word. We still have about 3 minutes left, so I'll let you answer that as well. And I want to get your thoughts on that, Arif, because to me it does seem like a bit of a paradox, right? Where we're holding the money back, but at the same time we're not expecting the repercussions as they are happening in front of our eyes.
I think the situation in Afghanistan is really dire. According to the new report that came out yesterday, 97% of the population is heading towards extreme poverty by the end of this year, and there is no perspective inside that the United States of America would release or unfreeze the fund they have been holding for a year now, and we don't really understand whether that fund, if that was unfrozen, that was a kind of given to the Taliban, that will help the country in any way or shape or not. Because the Taliban over the last decades or so, they have shown that they have not been a kind of working towards building a functioning government, and also towards preparing for that day. But unfortunately, they have just been on a course of self-destruction, and they have been on a course of destruction of alternatives. So it has been quite difficult for the people of Afghanistan, and also I'm sure it would be almost impossible for the Taliban just to kind of overcome the challenges in terms of economy, politics, security, legitimacy, whatever it is. So what is clear is that the violence will definitely expand across the country, as I have been witnessing different groups emerging from different parts of the country. And then that will definitely contribute to a renewed cycle of violence. In addition to that, I think the people, when they get hungry, they'll definitely become angry. Then the Taliban will not have the resources, the ability, the skills, the resources, the structures, and the management to handle with that hungry and angry people. So the Taliban, I think, the future for the Taliban is bleak, and it is even bleaker and darker for the population, for the people of Afghanistan, for the ordinary citizens. Right. So I'm really disappointed by what is going on on the ground, and it will definitely continue to us in the months and the years to come.
Okay, well, I'm going to have to leave it there at that, but I do sincerely appreciate Arif Sahar and Melissa Chiovenda for taking their time out of the no doubt busy schedules for us and to share their insight with us on how we've gotten to here at this point in Afghanistan with the Taliban takeover a year ago, as well as what this has meant for the Afghan people who must always be, of course, at the center of these conversations, be it women's rights, the economy, security, minorities, etc. We will, of course, be back next week, viewers, with another, of course, topic, of course, for you to watch here on the MTV Scope. Please do join us for that as well. And please, of course, always send in your comments at the numbers on your screen. Thank you very much for watching.